Hello, welcome to this session on calling simple touches. Today we're going to look at a few different things to do with starting to call touches at a practice night, for example. We'll think a bit about the beginnings of that, so looking at saying go and that's all and stand for a plain course of a method. We'll think about what the purpose is of having bobs, why we ring touches in different methods, and then look at some practical examples of touches that you can have a go at calling once we're back to ringing as normal. So thinking about plain bob doubles, plain bob minor, and a little bit about Grandsire doubles. I'll also go through some resources that you could use to help develop your conducting skills. So we're starting from a beginner's point of view, pretty much, but any technical terms that I use, I'll try to explain what they are. I'll be talking about things like lead ends, obviously about bobs, a bit about types of methods, that sort of thing. Okay, so let's think a bit about the very beginnings of conducting and of calling things for the very first time. There are three things that we have to get used to saying, which we can practice at a practice night with saying go and stop for plain courses of methods before we get into calling touches. Some of you might have already done this, others perhaps not. So we'll start from the very basics, which are the three things that we need to get used to saying are go, stand, and that's all. Go, we would say at a hand stroke to start a method. That's all. Opinion on this varies a bit. Some people say it quite early on, so when the treble's leading at hand stroke before it comes into rounds at the next stroke. Some people say it around about here when the treble's leading at backstroke. You can stretch it from around about here through into there, sort of that's all, which I tend to do for something that's a bit more high stakes, where you definitely want people to make sure they get into rounds at the end. It depends on how it's going. So that's all's normally said around about here, that sort of area. Go and stand are said at a hand stroke. With most calls in ringing, general view is that we try to call with a whole blow of warning, whole pull of warning, so that people know that what sort of action they're going to have to take the next time they're ringing that stroke. So go and stand, generally said at a hand stroke for a starting method, or standing at the next hand stroke. Bobs, as we'll see, said generally two blows before the bob would take effect. Same for singles as well. Quick thing about saying stand, a few things to think about here. The quick thing about saying stand is normally we would hope we'd be saying that at the end of a piece of ringing. On occasion, it's possible that if the quality of the ringing has deteriorated for whatever reason, you might have to say stand a little bit earlier on, but that varies, and hopefully that's not something you'd have to do. So we've got go and that's all, and stand to get the hang of. One other aspect of this to think about that's worth considering is the need to think about when you say go. So it's generally worthwhile spending a bit of time at the start of a piece of ringing, letting the rhythm settle, letting the rounds settle, so that the ringing has as good a chance as possible as being as high quality as possible. And this is the start of us thinking perhaps a bit about being responsible for the quality of ringing, as well as what's actually happening with the calling and that sort of thing. The other thing to think about is tone of voice. So we want to say go and that's all and stand loudly and clearly enough for people to be able to hear, but we don't want to be bellowing it across the tower in some way that sounds absolutely terrifying and scary. So there's a balance to be struck there. Trying to project the voice a little bit is a good idea. Just to briefly illustrate this point about when to start the ringing, we're going to have a quick look at a demonstration using a bell of just what that might look like. So if If we had ringing starting like this, we wouldn't probably want to say go, whereas if it's settled down like that, that's more like the right place to say go to a particular method.
Stand.
Okay, so that's just to briefly illustrate that point there. So go, that's all, and stand are things that we can practice with a plain course of plain hunt or plain bob doubles or Grandsire doubles or something else at a normal practice night. If there are any problems with the ringing, think about saying stand. If the ringing's not settling, give it a bit more time before saying go. Other top tips there. We're now going to think a bit about like what's the purpose of bobs? What are they for? Why do we ring things with bobs anyway? And this really goes back quite a long way actually in ringing history, when the early change ringers, one of the key aims of things that they were trying to achieve was to ring extents, so 120 changes of doubles or 720 changes of minor, or eventually in the early 1700s, 5,040 changes of triples as well. And when these early ringers were aiming to do this, what they started to think about was methods that would enable them to ring all 120 changes of doubles, for example. Grandsire doubles is a good example of a method that evolved out of this desire to ring 120 changes. Originally, they didn't so much think of it as a plain course of a method and a bob. They thought of it as one whole piece of ringing. The 120 of Grandsire doubles is a good example of this. But that's where it started, the desire to ring for longer and to try to ring all the possible changes within a given number of bells. And that's what bobs help us to achieve. We're going to have a look on this slide at how they do that. First quick practical thing is about what happens with bobs. So when a bob is called in doubles, plain bob doubles, and in other methods where seconds is made at the lead end and you're ringing it with what are called fourths place calls, we'll talk about what that is in a moment, you have a bob called just before the treble is going to lead full. So these two blows in lead where the treble, bell 1, indicated with this red line, is leading. And effectively, what happens is the bob is called when the treble is in the seconds place at backstroke here, just before it leads, and the bob takes effect here at backstroke of the treble's lead when it's leading full. In plain bob doubles, normally, we might remember from our method ringing, a bell makes seconds and there's dodging in 3/4. When there's a bob in plain bob doubles and all other seconds place methods with seconds at the lead end and calls that are made in fourths place, a bell runs in, a bell runs out, and a bell makes fourths, makes the bob. And the effect of this is that at each call, if these are called, these bobs are called in the same position each time in each course of the method, so a whole course of plain bob doubles is 4 leads and 40 changes long. If you have a bob called in the same place, so like the 4th lead of 4 leads of a 4-lead course, each time, 3 times, then you end up back where you sort of back where you started, or back in the plain course, as it were. Let's have a look at that in practice. So we can see that, as we've said, a bell runs out, a bell runs in, a bell makes the bob. If we think about ringing a touch of plain bob doubles, we might remember that if you're affected, you do each of those pieces of work once. At one of the bobs, you'll make fourths. At one of the bobs, you'd run in. At one of the bobs, you'd run out. And because all 3 bells that are affected, and there's one bell that's unaffected, because all 3 bells that are affected are doing each of those pieces of work once, they sort of rotate around the different bits of work and rotate their positions relative to each other in the course and in the coursing order, which we'll look at in a different session. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the row at the beginning of plain bob doubles, rounds. If we were to call a hypothetical touch of bob doubles, plain bob doubles, where there was a bob at the end of each course, so at lead 4 of the 4 lead course, at the first of those bobs, which we've got bob 1 here, the 4 would run in, the 2 would run out rather than making seconds as it would do at the end of a plain course, and the 3 makes fourths at the bob. So we have this change here, 1, 4, 2, 3, 5. We might notice that these 3 bells then have rotated around. The 4 has gone in, 2's in 3rd place, 3's in 4th place. If we wait 4 more leads and call a bob at the end of the next course, the 3 is the bell that runs in, the 4 is the bell that runs out, and the 2 makes the bob. Again, they've sort of rotated around, haven't they? And then 4 leads later, if we call another bob, the 2 is the bell that runs in, the 3 runs out, the 4th makes the bob, and that brings us back to rounds, and that's all, and that's the end of our touch. And it's this principle applies to any method where you're ringing with 4th place calls and a 2nd place lead end bell making seconds when the treble's leading. So methods like this include plain bob on any stage, minor, major, royal. It includes Cambridge surprise minor, Yorkshire surprise major, methods like that, Cambridge Royal, Maximus, whatever. Bells where seconds is made, if you call 3 bobs in the same place in the course, so lead number 2 of a however many lead course each time, then after 3 bobs, those 3 bells that are affected will have rotated round and you'll be back in the order that you started in. We'd think of this perhaps as a coursing order, but that's for a different session. But you'd end up back in, for example, if you're just doing this from a plain course, you'd end up back in the plain course after 3 bobs in the same position. And so this is a very useful tool and very useful thing for us to know, because for doubles, it enables us to ring extents, so 120 blocks of 120 changes. And on higher numbers, it enables us to have blocks of bobs which help us to extend the length of the ringing. So 3 bobs in the same place in a course in, for example, plain bob minor, as we'll see, only gives you 180 changes. It doesn't give you an extent. But different blocks like this can be combined together to make up an extent of 720 changes. And so bobs are a tool to help us extend the length of the ringing that we're doing, because we all know that ringing for short periods of time is not enough. We want to ring for longer, and so calls enable us to do that. So now we're going to have a look at the first example, practical example of a touch that you could call at a practice night when we return to ringing. And I'm going to start with calling yourself to be unaffected by the bobs in a 120 of plain bob doubles. We saw on the previous slide how in bob doubles you have 3 bells that are affected and 1 bell that is not affected by the calls. In the example I was looking at and showing you, it was the 5th that wasn't affected by the calls. This principle of calling yourself unaffected can be done from any bell, however. It can be done from the 4 or the 2 or the 3 or the 5. As we'll see in a moment. This blue line that we've got here, so we've got the blue line for the 2, showing the work that the 2nd bell is doing. The red line shows where the treble is, and we've got the bell numbers for the other bells written out. If we were to call this touch from the 2, just as that's the example that we've got here, we would start, we'd say, go plain bob doubles, nice and clearly. We would come into lead, come up to 5th place, do 3, 4 down, go down to lead. We wouldn't call a bob there because that would mean we'd be affected. Go down to lead, come up to 5th place, and just as we're coming up to 5th place here, we would want to call a bob. Now, if you leave it to when you're pulling your backstroke, that might be a little bit too late. We kind of want to think, so I'm passing the treble at handstroke here, treble's going down here at backstroke into 2nd place, and call the bob in this sort of area instead, fractionally earlier than here. So around about here we'd call a bob. Then there's treble leading here at handstroke, you're still in 5th place. At this lead end here, where the treble's leading at backstroke. In this case, the 3 would run in, the 5 would run out, the 4th would make the bob. And we've called the first bob of our set of 3 bobs that we're calling each time we're making long fifths. Then we'd continue to ring the rest of the course. We do 3, 4 up, come up to the back, down, make seconds at the next lead end. Carry on from where we'd started into lead, up to 5th place, 3, 4 down. You can sort of think, if you're calling yourself unaffected, sort of think of this 3, 4 down as your 1 leads warning for the long fifths, because it's the piece of work that you do before making long fifths. So at this point and in this lead where you're hunting, you might start to think, okay, next lead, at the next lead, I've got to call a bob when the treble's in 2nd place just before leading. And you might be preparing yourself for that during this lead. It's quite a useful way to stay on top of the conducting you're doing. I do it for this and for more complicated things as well. So when you get up into 5th place for the 2nd time, call another bob. These bells will rotate around in a different order, forward, run in, for example. Ring the rest of the course through to 3, 4. That's your 1 leads warning, down to lead. Okay, coming up past the treble. Treble's in 2nd place, coming up to 5th place. Bob for the 3rd time. And what would happen at this bob, magically, assuming they haven't gone wrong, is the 5 would run in, the 4 would run out, the 3 would make the bob, and you'd get 1, 5, 4, 3, 2, which brings you back into the plain course. And then you'd ring the rest of the plain course, get to this point where you're making seconds, and around about here, say that's all, and you've successfully called your first 120 of bob doubles. Now, there are different signs and other things you can look at in terms of conducting and helping to keep that right. You might be noticing the bell that's making the bob underneath you in 4th place, perhaps. The bell that comes off the back before you get to the back is the one that runs in. The bell that comes up and takes you off from the back is the bell that's run out. Things like that you can look out for, but we're mostly focusing on the calling here. So calling yourself unaffected is the first and easiest touch that you can call. 3 bobs each time you're coming up into 5th place, having done 3, 4 down at the previous lead. However, we might want to call something a bit more complicated once we've mastered that particular challenge. And so we might want to think about calling ourselves affected. Now, just to briefly highlight, what I've put here is which bell is the bell that's unaffected, depending on where in the course you call a bob. So if you call a bob at the 1st lead of the course, the 4th is the bell that's unaffected. At the 2nd lead, it's the 2nd that's unaffected. At the 3rd, it's the 3 that's unaffected. And at the 4th lead, it's the 5th that is the bell that's unaffected. So to start to think about calling yourself affected, and this is something that's definitely harder than calling yourself unaffected, there are several things to do, really. The first one is to spend some time thinking about 2 things. Firstly, which bell are you going to call to be unaffected? And from the bell that you're going to ring, how will that mean your bell will be affected by the calls? So that you have some anchoring points. You're not just always looking for that bell you're calling unaffected to be in 5th place. You can do that with experience and after quite a lot of practice. But to start with, you want to think about, well, what will I be doing at those calls? So just as an example, if we were again starting from the 2 and we wanted to call the 4th unaffected, the first call we'd put here, and rather than dodging 3, 4 down, we would run in to 2nd place. The next time round, the next time we called a bob, we would be running out, and the 3rd time of calling the bob, we'd be making 4ths. We do this in, out, make the bob pattern. To call other bells unaffected, so if we were doing the 3, the first bob from the 2 would be to make the bob, so we do this 4ths, in, out. And if we were calling the 5th unaffected, the first thing we'd call ourselves to do is to run out. So we do out, then the next bob we'd be making 4ths, and the next bob we'd be running in. And you can learn those patterns, which are a rotating pattern. You'll notice 4ths, in, out, 4ths, out, 4ths, in are all rotations of each other. We can learn those patterns and use that to help anchor our calling of other bells as unaffected bells. So that's about how we call ourselves unaffected, and then how we can spend some time studying the way in which we'd be affected if we want to call ourselves affected to a touch of plain bob doubles. Okay, now if you can call a 120 of plain bob doubles, you're in a good position to be able to call a quarter peal. There are 10 extents, 10 120s, make up 1,200 changes. That's a little bit short for a quarter peal, so in order to get a full 1260, we need to call something extra. And that's why we are having a look at this touch, a 60 of plain bob doubles, so half of an extent. This is a really good touch to call to practice being affected by the calls in a fairly controlled sort of way. The way this touch works, it's only possible from the 4th or the 5th. You can obviously call it from the 2 or the 3, but you'll be affected in lots of different ways at those calls. But from the 4th or the 5th, this example, we've got it from the 5th, you're basically calling a bob and then leaving a plain lead, or a plain lead and then a bobbed lead 3 times. And if you're calling it from the 5th, the way that works is you come down to lead. Where you would have done 3/4 up, you call a bob, and you make 4ths at the bob. That means that at the next lead end, you'll be making long 5ths. So you're effectively back where you started at the beginning of that course. And if we look at this change here, 1, 3, 4, 2, 5, we'll see that that's a rotation of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3 and 4 in seconds, thirds place, and the second in 4ths place. Next time the 5 would do 3/4 up, you call another bob, and we've got, when it gets back to 5ths place, long 5ths, we've got another rotation, 1, 4, 2, 3, 5. And then in this final section, again, calling ourselves to make the bob. And when we get to long 5ths, we're back in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've come back to rounds. And that gives you 60 true changes of plain bob doubles. If you call it from the 4th, then you're calling bob at the second lead of the course, and you're calling yourself to make the bob. And then long 5ths is at the first lead of the course. So those are the ingredients of a quarter peal of plain bob doubles. The only difficulty there then is counting to 10 extents, and there are different techniques and ways of doing that that you can learn. So for example, doing 2 extents of having the 4 unaffected, 2 for the 2, 2 for the 3, 2 for the 5, and then 2 more is quite a useful way of thinking about that, perhaps. Or if you're just going to call yourself unaffected all the way through, thinking carefully about the ways in which you're going to count them, breaking them up into blocks of 2 or 3, perhaps, is a good technique. So that's our calling of plain bob doubles. We can practice each of these when we're back into ringing, starting perhaps with calling ourselves unaffected, then having a go at calling a 60, and then having a go at calling touches to be affected. What we're going to look at now is how we can apply over some of those principles from plain bob doubles to plain bob minor and to other methods as well. Once we've got up to plain bob minor for calling, we've now got 5 working bells, 5 inside bells, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The trebles, again, shown with this red line here. Those 5 working bells do 5 different bits of work in a plain course. We've got seconds, 3, 4 down, 5, 6 down, 5, 6 up, 3, 4 up. We might notice that given that we have the same type of bobs, we have 4ths place bobs where we have a bell running in, a bell running out, and a bell making the bob. We now have 2 positions where a bell can be unaffected by the calls. We no longer just have long 5ths. We have 5, 6 down where you wouldn't be affected by a bob. And we have 5, 6 up where you would not be affected by a bob. And these 2 calling positions become very, very important for calling basically anything on 6 bells upwards. For reasons best known to themselves, the ringers of yesteryear decided to give these 2 calling positions names. 5, 6 down, they named home, and 5, 6 up, they named wrong. Now, I think the reason for this is that at the end of a plain course of plain bob minor, the 6th is dodging 5-6 down and comes back into 6th place where it started the course. It is effectively home. It's back in its home position. 5-6 up, it's dodging in 5-6, the same general area as it would at the end of the course, but the wrong way up to be in the home position. I think that's where they came from. So we've got two calling positions which would have your bell unaffected, wrong and home. And to call a simple touch of 180 changes, as I mentioned earlier in this talk, you can simply call yourself either to call a bob each time you get up to 5-6 up to a wrong, and that's in this case with from the 6th, the first lead of the course each time. So 3 wrongs, or 3 bobs at home. So calling the bob here when we're just here at the back, you'd effectively be calling it sort of just, there. Calling a bob and then 5-6 down 3 times for 3 homes. And the effect is going to be exactly the same as in bob doubles. A bell will run in, a bell will run out, and a bell will make the bob. And those 3 bells will rotate around in the same way as they would in bob doubles until we end up back in the plain course, back in the course that we were in before. A few sort of points about that just quickly. Wrong and home on minor, major, royal, upwards are generally calling positions from the tenor. This is for a few reasons, but basically to do with the type of music that the back bells are generating. And so the tenors on major or royal, for example, are often kept coursing each other, following each other around, kept together without splitting them, and calls at wrong and home and middle for major and upwards allow those back bells to be kept together, which has generally been found to be a musical thing to do. However, for calling simple touches, you don't have to always ring the 6. In fact, you don't have to ring the 6 at all to call this 180, touch of 180 changes. You can call it from any bell, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. When you get to a wrong or get to a home, 5-6 up or 5-6 down, calling a bob 3 times will bring you back into the plain course. And then you get to the end and you can say that's all, and then you've rung a touch. The just key thing to kind of note from that, though, is that for calling quarter peals, for calling longer touches of minor, and for calling quarters or touches of major and upwards, if you're going to ring a different bell other than the tenor, and I'd strongly encourage that, it's a good thing to do, you wouldn't be calling yourself to be unaffected in those calling positions. If you look at a composition of bob major, for example, you'd instead have to think about how you're going to know where the tenor is and where you are relative to the tenor. So for calling simple touches of minor, this is great. You can call 3 wrongs or 3 homes from any bell, but for calling things on higher numbers and for calling quarter peals, you sort of need to think about how you're going to know where the tenor is. So that's the first touch, calling block of 3 bobs, either in wrong or in home. The second touch is 120 changes, so shorter, a bit more serviceable for a practice night, perhaps. From the tenor, it's wrong, bob at wrong, here, 5-6 up, ring the rest of the course, and then a bob at home, then a bob the next lead at the wrong, ring the rest of the course, and then a bob at home. From any other bell, 2, 3, 4, or 5, the first bob you'd call would be a home, and then the next bob you'd call would be a wrong. That's because all of these other bells, 5, 3, 2, and 4, where they start, the first place they get to is a home. They get there before the wrong. So you don't wait until the wrong, you call a bob at home, and then a bob at wrong. So home, wrong, from 2, 3, 4, or 5 gives you 120 changes. Wrong, home from the 6th gives you 120 changes as well. And wrong, home, wrong, and just leaving that and not calling home, that will give you 360 changes. You can extend that, this is from the 6th again, you can extend that to a 720 to an extent with a couple of singles which affect 2 bells. And then you've got some ingredients for a quarter peal again. But we're mostly focusing on practice night touches here, so we won't say much more about that. Quick bonus touch for plain bob minor is to call bobs at the first 2 leads of the course, and then a plain lead. At the first lead, the 5 would make the bob. At the second lead, the 6th would make the bob. And at the third lead, 5 and 6 come back together on the back in 5/6, dodge with each other. And a bit like that 60 of plain bob doubles, the 3 bells beneath them are rotating around. And calling that 3 times gives you a nice short touch of 108 changes, which is quite useful for a practice night or a Sunday service touch. Something to emphasize here is that the calling positions wrong and home are the same in all methods with seconds made at the lead end. So here in Cambridge Minor, they come up in a different order. Wrong isn't the first lead of the course, it's the third lead of the course. The home is still at the end of the course for the tenor. And the effect on the bells and on the coursing order, if we were thinking about it like that, is exactly the same. 2's running in here, 3's running out, and 5's making the bob. And in fact, the effect of a wrong in even methods on really high numbers of bells, like Cambridge Maximus, the 2 would still run in. At that first bob at wrong, the 3 would still run out, and the 5 would be the bell making the bob. All the other bells would be dodging above that. And so these wrongs and homes are actually really useful building blocks for all sorts of methods, including some things that strike us perhaps as really complicated, but perhaps when we look at it actually aren't as complicated in their calling as we might think they are. For example, Bristol Maximus, which you might see quarter peals of rung at rings of 12, 1344, 1,344 changes of Bristol Maximus, looks like it must be very, very complicated in terms of calling. The most popular calling for a quarter peal of Bristol Maximus is wrong home, which is the same calling as your standard practice night 120 of plain bob minor. So actually these calling positions extend onto other numbers of bells and are really useful on other numbers of bells. I've talked quite a lot about calling positions for plain bob and seconds place methods. I just want to spend a little bit of time looking at another useful thing you can call at a practice night or on a Sunday, and that's Grandsire doubles. Grandsire is quite different because in Grandsire doubles and triples, and caters and so on, you have 2 hunt bells, which means that you've got 3 bells that are doing the work of the method, and in a plain course, the 2 is hunting round following the treble. We might remember this from our method ringing. Because of the structure of the method, the bobs actually take effect at a hand stroke when the treble's leading at hand stroke here. And so we call the bob earlier than in plain bob. We call it at a hand stroke when the treble's in thirds place. This can be sometimes a bit harder to spot, but look out for the bell that's coming down before the treble if you can. So you'll pass a bell and then the treble. When that bell that you passed just before the treble is leading, that's pretty much the time to call your bob. Now, let's look at one simple touch that you can call either from the 3 or from the 5th. And this is what's known as a half hunt pattern, another ringing term from the dim and distant past. Going through it from the 5th, we do 4/5 up, as normal for the start of the method, lie behind, down to lead, and then make thirds. We don't call a bob here. Go down into lead again, and then we pass a bell, in this case the 4th, and the treble at hand stroke, call a bob. Straight away, if not slightly earlier, just before you're passing the treble. Pass treble at hand stroke, then we do 1 dodge for the bob effectively, and we're back in 5th place. And just like that 60 of plain bob doubles, we'll see that these 3 bells beneath have rotated around. They're not in 1, 2, 3, 4 anymore. It's got 1, 3, 4, 2. Then we ring that again, do 4/5 up, thirds. As we're coming up here, we call a bob, do another double dodge 4/5 up. We've got 1, 4, 2, 3, 5. Thirds again to 4/5 up, call a bob. Sorry, as we're coming up, we would do 4/5 down. So coming up, pass the treble, call a bob, do 4/5 up. We get back to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you call that a plain lead and then a bob, then the 5th is the half hunt bell. If you start with a bobbed lead, just look at the 3 coming up here, then the 3 would be the half hunt bell and would be the one that would be making thirds at this second lead. To call it from the 3 or the 5, call a bob every time you're coming up to the back, passing the treble at hand stroke here, and you double dodge 4/5 up rather than lying behind and doing a single dodge 4/5 down. This can be used as a building block to create extents, 120 changes, by for one of these bobs substituting a single and then repeating the whole thing with the single in the same position. So say single, the plain single, plain bob, lead, plain single lead, plain bobbed, and that'll give you 120 changes. So that's a brief introduction to Grandsire doubles. The final thing I'd like us to quickly look at, there are a few resources that you can use to find out more about conducting and calling touches. And I'm just going to show some of these websites to you, having a look at quick look through them, and we'll see the sort of stuff that is out there about conducting. This is a really useful website that I only found when I was preparing for this this webinar, called callingtouches.co.uk. And it basically tracks the journey of a ringer as she taught herself to conduct, going from saying go, that's all, and stand, some of the things that we've talked about in this session, through to calling bob doubles, and then onwards into Grandsire, plain bob minor, Stedman, surprise major, talks about calling positions, coursing order, all sorts of different things. And I found this really interesting resource to look at. This is a website called Composition Library. You can use it to find, well, it's got 36,518 compositions at the time of this seminar. Lots of methods, all the wrong methods, and various collections of compositions as well. If we have a look for 120 of plain bob doubles, let's see what comes up. Oh, that's a funny one with singles. Let's have a look for 120 of plain bob minor and see what comes up. We can get a list of possible 120s and look at it in this sort of view. That's long ones. Okay, and here we go. Plain bob minor, wrong home, called from the tenor. We can get the blue line up so we can examine where the calls are happening in the course. There's lots of useful functions on here. This is the Central Council's Beginner's Guide to Conducting, written in the 1980s, called Will You Call a Touch Please, Bob? It's good, it's useful. The only slightly off-putting thing about it is that whenever the conductor's referred to, they're referred to as male. It is he who starts the ringing. Hopefully, we've moved beyond that now. Anyone can call, anyone can conduct, in my view anyway. And I think as long as we can get over that, or maybe change the language a little bit, it's still a useful document for looking at calling, and that's available for free via ringing.info. Steve Coleman's written a good book about calling called The Bob Caller's Companion. This is available via the post. You can order it to be posted to you. As he says, it's not a book for super brains, it's a book for ordinary ringers like you and me doing their best in the ordinary world of ringing. And yes, I think would be best described as an entertaining romp through the world of conducting, or that's what he would call it, I suspect, and is a really useful resource to look at as well. So that's a brief introduction to calling touches. I hope that when you're able to have a go at this in the tower, that it goes well. Thank you very much for listening, and bye for now.